The small town of Maplewood, Kentucky, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Appalachia, had always been known for its tranquil beauty. With its cobblestone streets, picturesque houses, and lush forests, it was the type of place where everyone knew everyone's name. But beneath its idyllic surface, Maplewood held a dark secret that had haunted it for decades. There was one particular spot on the outskirts of town that locals avoided, especially after sunset. It was a stretch of highway leading out of the town, where an old oak tree stood alone on the edge of a dense forest. To the untrained eye, the tree might have seemed like any other ancient oak, its twisted branches reaching out to the sky like gnarled fingers. But for the people of Maplewood, this tree was infamous for something far more sinister. The tree had a reputation for being haunted. The story had been passed down through generations, whispered over campfires, and discussed in hushed tones during family dinners. Those who ventured near the tree at night often spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, ghostly figures, and an overwhelming feeling of dread. But it wasn't until a series of tragic events in the 1980s that the legend truly took hold. It all began one cold winter night in 1985, when a group of teenagers, looking for a thrill, decided to venture to the infamous tree after dark. They had heard the stories how the tree was cursed, how anyone who touched it would die in a matter of days. The tales had never been taken seriously by the younger generation. But that night, something changed. As the teenagers approached the tree, they saw a shadowy figure hanging from one of its thick branches. It wasn't just any shadow, it was a woman, her body swaying in the wind as if suspended by an invisible force. Her hair was long and wild, flowing around her face like a veil. Her clothes appeared tattered, as though they had been torn by some unseen force. The group froze in place, unable to move or speak. One of the boys, eager to impress the others, stepped forward and touched the tree. In that instant, the shadowy figure turned its head, locking eyes with him. The boy screamed and tried to pull away, but his hand was glued to the bark, as if some supernatural force held him in place. His friends rushed forward to help, but it was too late. Within seconds, the boy collapsed, lifeless. His body was found the next morning, cold and stiff, with his eyes wide open, frozen in terror. The cause of death was never determined. His friends, traumatized by the experience, fled the scene and never spoke of it again. After that night, a strange silence fell over the town. The once bustling highway near the tree was now empty after dark, as people began to fear the old oak and the ghostly presence that seemed to linger near it. The legend of the haunted oak grew stronger, and soon no one dared to approach it. Fast forward a decade, and the legend of the haunted oak still loomed over Maplewood. Jack Harrison had just moved to the town. A young police officer in his mid-30s, Jack had spent most of his life working toward this moment. He had grown up in a small town much like Maplewood, and his dream had always been to serve and protect a community like this one. After years of hard work and dedication, Jack had been promoted to a post in Maplewood, where he was to serve as the town's deputy sheriff. He was excited to start this new chapter in his life, but little did he know that his arrival would coincide with the resurfacing of old legends that had haunted the town for years. On his first day in the office, Jack was greeted by his fellow officers, including Officer Miller, an older, seasoned cop who had been in Maplewood for over 20 years. Miller welcomed Jack to the town and gave him a tour of the area. As they drove through the quiet streets, Miller casually mentioned the infamous haunted oak. "You know, the old oak down by the highway? You'll hear all kinds of stories about that tree," Miller said, his voice tinged with a hint of caution. "People say it's cursed, that anyone who touches it will die within days." Jack, being a man of logic, didn't believe in such superstitions. He was used to dealing with real crime, burglaries, domestic disputes, and the occasional drunk driver. He had no time for ghost stories. "I've heard about places like that before," Jack replied dismissively. "It's just a tree, right? Officer Miller didn't seem convinced. I wouldn't be so sure about that. There's been some strange things that have happened around that tree. People have gone missing, cars have crashed, and there's been talk of a woman's ghost hanging from it. The folks here in town, they take it seriously. Jack raised an eyebrow. Come on, Miller. You don't honestly believe that, do you? Miller didn't respond. Instead, he just gave Jack a long, meaningful look before changing the subject. But the seed of curiosity had been planted in Jack's mind. Later that evening, after his shift ended, he decided to take a ride to the oak tree himself, just to see what all the fuss was about. It was a crisp autumn evening when Jack set out for the oak tree. He had heard the stories, but he needed to see it for himself. As he approached the stretch of highway leading to the tree, he noticed the eerie silence that surrounded the area. The road was deserted, and the only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots. Jack stood at the edge of the highway, looking at the tree. Its gnarled branches stretched out into the darkening sky like skeletal fingers. The air around the tree felt heavier, colder, as if it were a magnet for all the fear and dread that had accumulated over the years. He took a few steps closer to the tree, his flashlight illuminating the twisted bark. The stories of the ghostly woman haunted his thoughts, but Jack still wasn't convinced. He touched the tree's rough surface, expecting to feel nothing more than the chill of the autumn air. But as soon as his fingers made contact with the bark, he felt a jolt of energy run through him, cold, electrifying, as if the tree itself was alive. Suddenly, a low, almost inaudible whisper filled the air. Jack froze. The voice seemed to come from all around him, yet no one was there. It was a woman's voice, soft and haunting, calling his name. Jack. He spun around, his heart racing, but the highway was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, he considered turning back, but curiosity drove him to stay. He reached into his jacket pocket for his flashlight, but when he shone it back toward the tree, something caught his eye. At first, it was a mere flicker, a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. Then, as if emerging from the fog, he saw her, the woman. She was standing beneath the oak tree, her long, flowing white gown fluttering in the wind. Her hair was wild, and her face was obscured by the shadows. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice shaky but determined. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing her pale, lifeless face. Her eyes were empty sockets, glowing with an unnatural light. She smiled a cruel, mocking smile that sent a chill through Jack's spine. Without thinking, Jack drew his gun, but his hand trembled. The woman stepped forward, her feet gliding over the ground like she wasn't walking at all. Her eyes never left his, and with each step, Jack's fear grew. He wanted to run, but his feet felt frozen to the ground. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman whispered. "You shouldn't have touched the tree." Suddenly, Jack felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if an invisible force had gripped him. He staggered back, gasping for breath. The woman's laughter echoed in his ears, and the world around him began to spin. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, unable to move. As his vision blurred, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He tried to call out, but his voice failed him. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the woman's face, her eyes glowing with malevolent joy. When Jack finally regained consciousness, he found himself lying on the cold, damp ground near the oak tree. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, and his head throbbed with pain. He could barely move, but as his eyes fluttered open, he saw the tree looming in the distance. The woman was gone. The air around him felt lighter, but the fear remained. Jack slowly made his way back to the highway, his body still shaking. As he walked, he heard the faint sound of a police siren approaching. His colleagues arrived shortly after, rushing to his side. "Jack, what happened?" Officer Miller asked. his voice filled with concern. Jack could barely speak. His mind was racing, but the words wouldn't come. He had seen the ghost, felt the energy of the tree. There was no denying it now. He was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed he had been in a coma for nearly a week. The injuries he sustained that night were severe, but it was his psychological state that concerned them most. Jack had been severely traumatized, and the doctors recommended he take time off to recover. Months passed before Jack fully recovered from the incident. The memory of that night stayed with him, haunting his every thought. He tried to move on, but the fear and the questions lingered. Was it real? Had he been the victim of some supernatural force? Or had his mind simply cracked under the pressure of the job? He never returned to Maplewood. He requested a transfer to another county, leaving behind the town and the haunted oak. The legends of the haunted tree continued to thrive, whispered from one generation to the next. But Jack Harrison knew the truth. He had faced something beyond comprehension, something that could not be explained by logic or reason, and he would never forget the cursed oak of Maplewood.